Perhaps no Albuquerque neighborhood represents as much history and culture as Martineztown, the neighborhood just northeast of the city's center, and perhaps no part of the city has undergone such a dramatic cycle of boom, bust, and revival. Once an area of sandhills used for sheep and cattle grazing, the first settlement of Martineztown occurred in the 1820s when a stop was established along Bernalillo Road, a portion of the famous El Camino Real, or Royal Highway, that extended from Mexico City to San Juan Pueblo. In the 1850s, Manuel Martin and his wife Ana Maria left Old Town to establish a settlement near what is now Edith and Mountain Road. For years, it remained a small farming town with a few businesses mixed in. But long before El Camino Real and the establishment of Martineztown, the area served as the ancient crossroads for travel and commerce for the indigenous people of the Southwest.
The Camino Real, in essence, is an indigenous trail of the Indians coming up from Latin America through Mexico into the Americas, and from the Americas going south into Mexico and into Latin America. And so it was by nature an indigenous trail that connected cultures and people in the American continent. When the Spanish came to the Americas, one of the early expeditions, Juan Oñate, in 1598, started in Mexico City and traveled all the way up through Mexico into New Mexico and finally ended up in Sangreville Pueblo, just immediately north of Santa Fe. And that was the original excursion of the European culture coming into the Americas. It basically followed the Rio Grande coming into New Mexico on the west side of the river as it approached Albuquerque. There at close to Bridge Street, they came down what is now Tijeras Avenue, and then went up to what is now the short stretch called Dr. Martin Luther King. And then on the old Bernalillo Road, which is now Edith Boulevard, they turned north to head straight into Santa Fe. Well, the Tijeras Canyon Trail came down the drainage basins on top of the ridge and then intersected with the Camino Real, the north-south route, indigenous route. And the Tijeras Canyon Trail was for the Plains Indians, the Carnuel Indians, and the Tiwa Pueblo that was on the banks of the river. That was the way that they would get to it. And they would go through the Tijeras Canyon Trail to bring wood or wherever necessities that they might need in terms of natural resource. So this location in historical significance is the original crossroads in New Mexico, both north, south, east, and west.
Travelers, traders, settlers, and soldiers continued to use the trail well into the 19th century, and Martineztown served as a popular rest stop, or paraje, on the trail. In the 20th century, development began occurring in South Martineztown, the area south of Lomas Boulevard. St. Joseph's Sanitarium, later hospital, opened in 1902. Longfellow Elementary School arrived in the late 1920s, and numerous small businesses sprang up. The area continued to grow and prosper. By the 1950s, city fathers had a different idea for Martineztown, and the area was zoned for commercial and institutional uses, with the intent of building a new city hall and convention center. Voters rejected the bonds to finance the construction, however. Still, the damage was done as banks refused to finance residential loans and the city refused to issue residential building permits. The neighborhood began to deteriorate.
In the 60s, the city came back with the advent of urban renewal money nationally. The city came back with a proposal that was three parts in nature. It included the Albuquerque Public Schools, it included the St. Joseph Hospital, and of course the city as the conduit agency. And that proposal was to build a new Albuquerque High School in this area. And at the same time, the hospital was going to build their new hospital tower, and they were going to go ahead and purchase the Longfellow property from APS for their parking needs going into the future. All of this occurred unbeknownst to the residents. The first that the residents caught wind that they had been condemned was when the relocation officers started knocking on the doors and telling people that they had to leave. And this was a pretty traumatic experience for most of the folks, because most of them were elderly. This was their only investment that they had. And so they became quite concerned, very anxious about what was going on. As a result of that, the neighborhood organized itself into the Citizens Information Committee of Martineztown. We then proceeded to go ahead and unify ourselves, both the renters and the property owners. And then also began the process of identifying the technical assistance that we were going to need, the legal assistance that we were going to need to fight this in court, and then the planning and design assistance that we were going to need to come up with an alternative if that was going to be possible. So we had to get everybody excited about that they could, in fact, beat City Hall, that they could, in fact, come up with their own plan, and they could, in fact, create a vision in a community that they had always wanted to have, but could not because of the zoning that was placed on the community in the 50s and the strangulating effect it had on the infrastructure and on the ability to rehab houses, because we were redlined as a district. We didn't have any streets, we didn't have any sidewalks, we didn't have any amenities here.
It took almost 2 years, but the residents of Martineztown did in fact prevail over the wishes of civic leaders. The City Council voted to allow $4.5 million in housing and urban development funds to be used for redevelopment. The new Albuquerque High School was relocated nearby, and St. Joseph's purchased the old Civic Auditorium property for parking.
This community in all of America was only one of 2 urban renewal projects that was able to reverse itself from condemnation to redevelopment. And it was the only one that was able to reverse itself from condemnation to total redevelopment. So it has a unique place in American urban renewal history. Part of the urban development plan that the residents came up with was the fact that we were going to get infrastructure, our sidewalks, streets, and then also public amenities, public housing for the residents that needed public housing, and then also a public park. Because Martineztown never had a park. And this was the first park that Martineztown was going to have, even though it was, historically it's one of the oldest communities in Albuquerque.
Martineztown received its first piece of public art for the new park as the result of a very public controversy over the work of a sculptor, Luis Jimenez, and a fortuitous meeting on an elevator. In 1983, some residents of Old Town objected to Jimenez's plans for the Southwest Piet, a piece whose roots were in pre-Hispanic Mexico and honored indigenous peoples.
It was a difficult circumstance for the city because the city was beginning to embark on the notion of public art as a very valuable asset in the inventory of Albuquerque and one of its many amenities. And it got off to the wrong start with the Pieta.
The Albuquerque Arts Board at the time felt that the selection of Luis Jimenez as one of America's leading Chicano artists was going to be an amazing kickoff for the public art program. Little did they know that it would also kick off the very first controversy of this very early public art program in the late 1970s.
The mayor at that time, Harry Kinney, the Honorable Harry Kinney, was beside himself because he was caught between a rock and a hard spot. He was caught politically by a lot of his supporters that were not in favor of placing the Pieta in the Old Town area. And he was in between a rock and a hard spot with supporters of public art that wanted some public art in Albuquerque.
The Luis Jimenez Southwest Pieta was technically the first sculpture that was commissioned by the City of Albuquerque. The Albuquerque Arts Board, that was just forming at the time in 1978, had received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts for $25,000. And the City of Albuquerque 1% for Art program matched that grant, and this was the very first sculpture that the public art program commissioned.
Fortuitously, and a blessing in disguise, I was at City Hall on some other matters one day, and I went into the elevator and ended up with Mayor Harry Kinney in the elevator. And we started discussing it, and jokingly I mentioned that, boy, he sure was getting beat up on this Piet issue. And he mentioned to me how distraught it was for him to go through this, and he didn't know what to do, so on and so forth. And I suggested to him, well, we're proud to be who we are, and we'd like to have a good public art in our community. So we'd be willing to have it there in Martineztown. And he looked at me somewhat bewildered and said, "Are you serious?" And I responded, "Yes, we are." And I'm sure that the neighborhood would be more than receptive to it. And he mentioned, well, if the artist is willing to go ahead and move the art piece, then I think that it's something that we can do. And Luis Jimenez was tickled pink that in fact that Martineztown wanted the art piece. Within 2 days, we arranged him to come in to have a community meeting here in Albuquerque. The residents asked questions, and they voted unanimously to accept the art piece. We relayed that information to the mayor. The mayor then arranged a meeting of the Albuquerque Arts Board, and in short order, we presented before them, and they made the decision to relocate the Pieta from the Old Town community to here in Martineztown.
The artist himself did not spend a lot of time putting words in writing about the meaning of the sculpture. He mostly spent a lot of time at community meetings talking about it. But the public art program is the beneficiary of some amazing writing by Rudolfo Anaya, who Luis Jimenez did commission to write a statement about the artwork.
Once these mountains were living people, an Aztec warrior and the woman he loved. But their love was not destined to be. The woman dies. The warrior is overcome with grief. In Southwest Pieta, we see the warrior and the woman at this moment of death and grief, and we share their anguish. But the story tells us their love was so strong that even in death, their souls are transformed into the spirits and forms of the volcanoes. Rudolfo Anaya.
So nearly 30 years later in the public art program's history, this sculpture is still one of our most prominent, well-known pieces of public art.
In the year 2000, the White House Millennium Council cited the Southwest Pieta as one of 7 national treasures in the Southwest.
In 2002, when the Sisters of Charity from Cincinnati announced that they were selling the St. Joseph Hospital complex, it was natural for the neighborhood to be somewhat distraught. The sisters had been our neighbors, and they actually lived here in the community with us for 100 years. And so it's awfully tough when you lose a neighbor, but when you lose one that's been with you for 100 years, it's doubly tough. The neighborhood voted to find a way to commemorate the Sisters of Charity's 100 years of service to the state of New Mexico and to the residents of Albuquerque and the citizens in Martineztown. We commissioned Linda DeBow to come up with a concept for the art piece, and out of that effort came Angelitas de Caridad.
The Sisters of Charity sculpture represents a really unique way that the public art program acquires artwork on occasion. This particular neighborhood, the Martineztown neighborhood, did all their own fundraising to commission this sculpture, recognition of the history of the Sisters of Charity. And then they donated it to the public art program. We knew that the sculpture was going to be coming into this park, and we worked with the neighborhood over the entire process to make sure that the sculpture met all of the standard requirements that we require, and also worked very closely with the artist to make sure that it went in safely and securely. And it's a beautiful artwork that stands here in the far east end of the park.
Angelitas de Caridad not only is a commemorative to represent the tireless work of the Sisters of Charity, but it's also a location, a resting place that you can go and be at peace. So it really is a very attractive art piece that is a significant addition to the Albuquerque Public Art Program.
As someone who's knowledgeable about every piece of public art in the city, I can say that this is a really special park because we have 2 very large-scale monumental sculptures in one small park in the heart of downtown Albuquerque, and this is such a treasure. The park itself, especially with all the new amenities and the other small art elements that have been incorporated throughout the entire interpretive trail.
The assets have been magnified and brought all together to create a sense of history, to create a sense of place, that is very special and very unique, that brings together its fascinating history in a way that you can imagine living through it as you walk through the park and as you walk through the neighborhood and as you read the narratives and as you see the tiles of the animal life and the landmarks, as you see the etchings in the sidewalks of the 9 states of Mexico and the 9 counties of Texas and the U.S. As you see the historical wheel of New Mexico etched in the plaza, giving all the key dates of New Mexico history and the history of this little neighborhood. The tall and the short of it is that you have a cultural, historical, educational laboratory that you can walk through, run through, sit on, contemplate, and imagine and dream whatever has happened in the past and whatever can happen in the future.
And in 2016,
the Park Service asked us if the community and if the city would be willing to be a host to a centennial event of the National Park Service in New Mexico.
The trail has always existed in Albuquerque, but the opportunity to develop the trail, to provide a recreational experience and an educational experience right in an urban environment is really unique. And it's just tremendous that we were able to work so closely with the city and with the elementary school here and with the community to develop this as part of the National Historic Trail. Obviously, it doesn't look like it did 300 years ago, but you are on the trail right here. The trail went right through Edith Boulevard, so you were actually following the footsteps of the original trail travelers. And to be able to tie that to a community like this, where you have kids that come out and play and can learn about their history and have fun outside, enjoy the trail, and hopefully learn a little bit from it is just a great opportunity.
the efforts to build the park add public art and commemorate the original Crossroads of New Mexico has reaffirmed the historical significance of Martineztown, the past struggles of the neighborhood, and the fact that today it is alive and well.
From the very beginning, it was a fight to save our land, and that's what we did. We fought to save our home, our land, and our community. What has occurred now has been an affirmation of the prominence and the significance of the location of this community in its historical context and where it sits in its proper place in the history of Albuquerque.